Hi Art, this is just a quick run through of the talks. It's not complete, but this is what it's going to look like. So the title is Modeling the Eddy Scale Circulation in the California Current. This work has two students, Andrew Davis and Andrew Combs, who've used this work as part of their PhD. So the first the goals of this study are to understand the low-frequency variability in the along-shore and cross-shelf transport processes and to identify the forcing mechanisms for the transport dynamics. So I will introduce the modeling framework, which is an eddy resolving ocean modeling framework. The main idea is that we have a large-scale global eddy resolving model from the Japanese colleagues. This is a hindcast from the 1950s to present. Within this hindcast, we use this as a boundary condition for a nested CCS, or actually Northeast Pacific model that we run from 1950 to 2010. Now, because we are targeting eddy scale processes, rather than running this model once, we actually run it 6 times. So we produce essentially 6 hindcasts so that we can separate within these hindcasts over the period 1950 to 2010 the part of variance that is deterministic versus the part of variance that is intrinsic, which we expect to exist because this is a eddy scale model. Now, in terms of whether the model has some fidelity in capturing the realism of the circulation, here are some 2 slides that show that. So it turns out that this type of configuration can capture low frequency variability of the tracers, and these are previous studies that were conducted in the LTR showing California Cal-Coffee sea surface temperature and sea surface salinity and nutrients and so forth here in the various colors, and the black lines are essentially the equivalents in the model where we can see essentially tracks those low frequency variations. Now, because we're interested also in the eddy scale statistics, this is a slide now that shows how the model here, the ROMS model, captures eddy statistics. Here, these eddy statistics are quantified as the variance of the relative vorticity, which essentially is the entropy in these 2 maps. So this is what the satellite, the Aviso satellite shows. This is what the ROMS model 10 kilometers shows over this period. So they're comparable. There are some differences, but overall the main structure is similar. If we also go in further details in the statistics, for example, by counting the eddies that occur, for example, in the Central California region, here this is an example of the blue being eddy counts for the from the satellite, and the red eddy counts from the model. Of course, only over the satellite period, 94 to 2008. But we see that there's actually really good agreement, especially in the low frequency. So to some extent, we expect that there is a part of deterministic low frequency variability in the eddy scale circulations that the model is actually able to capture. And this is a paper that was actually sponsored by the LTR. With that in mind, then, I wanted to point out that in order to understand how the eddies and other circulation dynamics affect the transport of material properties that are relevant to biology, we conduct passive tracer release experiments within these models, and the ones conducted in the CCS region are also part of the larger project called POBEX, the Pacific Ocean Boundary Ecosystem and Climate Studies. And so that these passive tracer calculations were actually conducted in different regions, and some studies like this one compare these different regions and the different dynamics. But let's focus on the CCS one, and there's a paper that was again funded by the LTR by Vincent Combe as part of his PhD, who showed using passive tracers in the California Current that essentially the cross-shelf exchange processes are dominated by eddies. And what you're seeing in this slide essentially is a passive tracer released here at the coast, and you can see how all these entrainment of the tracer by eddy is very visible here in this picture. This is the sea surface side equivalent, showing the structure of the eddies, these labeled here as A1, A2, and so forth. We also see that these eddies are important in cross-shelf exchanges at depth. This is a tracer in the undercurrent that is being advected away from this eddy A2, which is right here in this picture. With that in mind, then the question becomes, what drives the low-frequency dynamics of these eddies? And so if we now take all the various model realizations that we have, these 6 realizations, some of them have different resolutions. We have 3 at 10 kilometers and 3 at 20 kilometers, and we plot the entropy, which is a measure essentially of the vorticity variance in the California Current, and we plot that as a function of time here in black for each of the models, and then we plot the ensemble mean here in red. We see that there's a significant fraction of low frequency variability in eddy statistics that is indeed connected to the the forcing. And so the question then is, what drives the ensemble mean or deterministic fraction of eddy variability? Well, we can diagnose this ensemble mean fraction. What we do is essentially, I can't go in right now very fast, but essentially what we find that this fraction of deterministic variance is driven by the cross-shelf gradient in the winds, this kind of pattern here. If we make an index of variability of those cross-shelf gradient in the winds, this is shown here in black, and then we integrate it with a simple AR1 model here in blue, we get this blue line here, and in red down here is the ensemble mean of the entropy. And so you see that we can reconstruct essentially a large fraction of the eddy statistics as measured as the entropy here with just a simple integration of this index of the wind stress curl gradient in the CCS. And so to some extent, this tells us that a large fraction of this eddy variance is energized locally also by the winds. Now moving to the longshore transport dynamics, essentially what dominates changes in the meridional currents. There is one theory that has been around by Clark and Dottori, which is associated with forcing by coastally trapped wave. We refer here to as a CTW theory. The idea is that when you have waves that are coming from the tropics in the CCS, they come along the coast as coastally trapped waves, but they're also refracted offshore as Rossby waves, and as they go offshore, essentially these large-scale Rossby waves will modulate the CCS meridional transport. Now, we did a study in 2013, and a different one, again by Andrew Davis, who was supported by the LTR, which showed that this kind of modulation by these large waves is actually very small compared to the changes in the meridional currents that happen at the eddy scale through local gradient in the wind stress curl, which is shown here. And so this is an example of a diagnostic model that shows the raw meridional transport in the model compared to, again, an AR1 model that is driven by the wind stress curl, showing again that you can essentially capture most of the low frequency variability in the alongshore meridional currents or the transport by this wind. We can also ask the question of how this local gradient in the wind stress curl is related with large-scale dynamics, and we find that to some extent part of it is connected to PDO, but not all of it. So there's a significant fraction of just regional variability. So to conclude, the summary here is that this local wind stress curl cross-shelf gradient has important implication. One, it controls the dominant low-frequency variations in the alongshore transport, example the meridional flow, and the cross-shelf exchanges through energizing mesoscale eddies. Its variability is associated with the 30 UF of sea level pressure over the North Pacific, and a fraction of its variability is associated with large-scale climate dynamics of the Pacific, in this case the PDO. And this leads us to believe that this wind stress curl gradient may have a strong impact on ecosystem processes and perhaps could be used to develop predictive and diagnostic indices. So this is about it. Thank you, Art.